Hello and welcome back to the channel. In every age of history, men and women have taken on work that was more than a profession, more than a way to earn bread or shelter, but a gamble with their very lives. From dusty arenas to shadowed mines, from storm-tossed ships to infected city streets, these were the most dangerous jobs in history, and tonight we shall wander through them together, not with haste or alarm, but with the slow rhythm of a story told at night, a story meant to guide you gently into sleep, while still stirring your imagination with the lives of those who came before. Before we begin this journey, I invite you to make yourself comfortable, to dim the lights, to let the weight of the day slip quietly from your shoulders, and to settle into a state of calm listening. If you enjoy stories like this, then I would be glad if you would consider liking this video and subscribing for more tales told in this same way. Share in the comments where in the world you are listening from and at what time it is. In the heart of the Roman Empire, beneath the hot sun and within the towering amphitheaters that dwarfed entire neighborhoods, there lived men who carried upon their shoulders a job unlike any other, a job that promised both fame and death in equal measure, the job of the gladiator. And while modern imagination paints them as heroic figures clad in polished armor, their reality was a fragile thread, stretched between spectacle and survival, for they were slaves, prisoners, or sometimes volunteers, who accepted the contract because of debt, despair, or a faint hope of glory. And when they stepped into the arena, they entered not a workplace, but a stage of blood, sand, and roaring voices. Imagine, if you will, the Colosseum at dawn, its great arches already humming with the arrival of citizens, vendors calling out the smells of bread and wine, the chatter of thousands preparing to watch human beings face the possibility of violent death as though it were entertainment. And beneath those stone corridors, in the dim torchlight, gladiators prepared themselves, some quietly sharpening blades, others whispering prayers to gods who might or might not be listening, and some pacing with the nervous energy of men about to test not just their skill but their fate. To be a gladiator was to be trained in specialized schools where discipline was strict and punishment harsh, where men learned the styles of combat, the names of their weapons, the formations of their bodies, and where each fighter was shaped into a character for the stage. Perhaps a Murmillo with heavy shield and sword, perhaps a Retiarius with net and trident, perhaps a Threx with curved blade, each type offering variety for the hungry eyes of the crowd. Yet, despite the cruelty, there was a strange allure. For those who survived long enough could become celebrities, admired and whispered about, their names scratched on walls, their likenesses carved on lamps, and their victories rewarded with gifts of palm branches, or even, in the rarest of cases, the wooden sword that symbolized freedom. But for most, the work was endless risk, and every time they stepped into the arena, their bodies became wagers placed by others, by emperors seeking popularity, by trainers seeking profit, and by audiences seeking a rush of excitement before returning to the ordinary rhythms of their lives. Consider the psychological burden of such a profession, waking each day not knowing if the next battle would end in triumph or death, carrying scars that burned long after the cheers had faded, enduring the isolation of being both admired and despised. 4 gladiators were both heroes and slaves, raised high upon the stage, yet kept low in the ranks of society, their lives always in the hands of those who owned them. And yet, some men volunteered, choosing this life when they might have lived quietly, because the promise of recognition, the chance to rise above obscurity, The possibility of earning riches or honor was more powerful than the fear of the sword. And in that paradox lies the essence of dangerous work, that people often step willingly into peril because the reward, whether material or spiritual, shine more brightly than the shadows of risk. As you picture the dust rising from the sand, the metallic clash echoing beneath the marble, and the sudden hush that fell before a final strike, remember that behind every spectacle was a man who had taken up a job as real as any, a job that consumed strength and breath, and a job that, for many, ended in silence upon the ground. Yet even in their danger, gladiators remind us of the human spirit's strange attraction to risk, to glory, to the chance to turn suffering into meaning. And, as we leave the Colosseum and step quietly out into the streets of ancient Rome, the sun lowering behind its walls, we carry with us the knowledge that this was only the first of many perilous professions, and that history still holds countless more waiting to be uncovered as our night's story continues. Far from the roaring amphitheaters of Rome, in the blazing deserts of Egypt, where the Nile wound its way like a silver thread through fields of green bordered by endless sands, another dangerous job took shape, one that was not performed for fleeting entertainment, but for eternity itself. For here, the laborers and craftsmen who built the mighty pyramids carried stones heavier than their own bodies, day after day, beneath the unrelenting sun. And while many later imagined them to be slaves, forced into service, the truth whispered by archaeology suggests a more complex story, for many of these builders were ordinary Egyptians drafted or employed, given rations of bread, beer, and onions, housed in makeshift villages of mud brick, and driven by a mixture of duty, faith, and necessity. Yet no matter the arrangement, the work was perilous beyond measure. For the act of shaping eternal tombs for kings required mortal men to risk their fragile bones. Picture the quarries where huge blocks of limestone were cut with copper chisels and wooden wedges, soaked with water until the rock cracked, men straining to guide the fragments free. And then the long haul across wooden sledges, dragged by dozens, sometimes hundreds of workers, each step stirring up clouds of dust that stung the throat and filled the eyes. Each pull of the rope burning into calloused hands, while overseers shouted orders to keep the rhythm steady. For one stumble might mean a crushed limb, or worse, a body pinned beneath stone with little hope of rescue. Imagine also the ramps that wound upward as the pyramid rose, higher earthen paths trampled by countless feet carrying stones up and up toward the sky, while the danger of collapse always lingered, a sudden slip of mud, a snapped rope, a stone that shifted without warning, sending men tumbling with no mercy but gravity's. And yet these builders were not faceless, for in the remnants of their village we see traces of humanity. Beer jars left behind, graffiti scratched into walls with simple sketches of ships or cattle, bones that reveal diets rich enough to keep them strong, and graves where workers were laid to rest with respect, suggesting that in their society they were valued for their role, even if the risks they faced were constant. The job was dangerous, not only because of heavy stones, but also because of the environment, the scorching heat that drained strength, the threat of disease in close quarters, the strain upon muscles and joints that bent men into weariness long before their time. And yet the pyramids still rose steady, and immovable monuments that demanded sacrifice from the bodies of those who built them. Why did they endure it? You may wonder, why did men and women consent to such dangerous toil? And the answer lies partly in survival, for wages, in the form of food and drink, meant security, for families, but also in belief, for to serve the Pharaoh was to serve a living God, and to labor on his eternal resting place was in their minds to take part in divine purpose, an honor that reached beyond their lifetimes. In this way, danger was cloaked in meaning, and hardship was softened by faith. For even as backs ached and hands split open, there was pride in being part of something grander than any individual life. Consider the strange balance of fragility and permanence. Men whose names are lost to time, giving their strength to structures that still stand thousands of years later. Their blood and sweat hardened into the very stones tourists marvel at today. And in this way, their dangerous job did not vanish with them, but lived on in the silent geometry of stone. As the sun set over the desert, turning the pyramids' faces to gold, the workers returned to their modest quarters, eating their rations, sharing laughter, tending wounds, and preparing to rise again at dawn. And though their lives were filled with risk, there was also community songs and stories told by firelight that eased the weight of the day. To imagine them at rest is to understand that danger and humanity have always been intertwined, that people accept risk when it grants them food, dignity, or a sense of belonging to something beyond themselves. And thus, as we leave the glowing sands of Egypt and step forward in history, we carry with us the sound of chisels, the groan of ropes, and the sigh of wind across stone, reminders that the path through dangerous work is often paved not by cruelty alone, but by faith, necessity, and the desire to leave behind a mark upon the world. As centuries passed and the world of pyramids and pharaohs gave way to castles, villages, and narrow cobbled streets, another job arose that was less glorious and far less celebrated. Yet it carried its own hidden dangers and placed men in constant peril of illness, collapse, and even violent attack. And this was the work of the medieval gong farmer, a title that sounds almost quaint today, but was, in truth, a grim reality. For these men were responsible for clearing the cesspits and privies of towns and cities, hauling away the waste of entire households and communities when night fell, working in silence beneath the moon so that their labors would not offend the delicate eyes of those who slept in comfort. Imagine the medieval town after dusk, the streets dark except for flickering lanterns, the air heavy with smoke from hearths, and the faint stench of human waste rising from the alleys. And into this shadowy world stepped the gong farmer, shovel in hand, rope and bucket prepared, ready to descend into pits filled with filth, their bodies lowered by companions or by their own weary arms. And once inside these foul places, they dug and hauled, filling barrels with sludge that was then carried away on carts to be dumped beyond the city walls. The danger of this job was not merely in the disgust that would turn most stomachs, but in the very real risk of suffocation. For the fumes of ammonia and methane rose thick in these enclosed spaces, stealing breath, burning lung, and sometimes rendering men unconscious before they could climb free. Their lives ended silently in the very waste they were tasked to remove. There was also the danger of collapse, as old pits sometimes gave way, burying workers in mud, and refused their cries muffled in the filth. And even when death did not come suddenly, disease lingered in every droplet, from dysentery to plague, each night's work, leaving the body weaker, the skin blistered, and the spirit heavy. Yet gong farmers continued, because towns required them, because waste must be removed for society to function, and because the wages, though despised by those who paid them, were often high enough to tempt men into the trade, sometimes granting them earnings that rivaled respectable craftsmen, though at the price of being shunned by neighbors who recoiled from their presence. To be a gong farmer was to live on the edge of society, necessary but unwanted, tolerated but avoided, feared for the stench that clung to their skin no matter how much they washed. And yet, without them, streets would have overflowed, disease would have spread even more swiftly, and the very order of medieval life would have decayed into chaos. Consider also the loneliness of their profession, for they worked in the darkest hours, often in pairs or small groups, the silence broken only by the scrape of shovel and the slosh of barrels. The lantern's glow throwing trembling shadows on damp stone walls. And though the town slept peacefully above, beneath its floors, men waded through danger to keep that peace intact. Some might ask why any man would take such a job, and the answer is woven in the eternal balance of survival, for poverty has always driven men to places where others would not tread, and necessity has always outweighed pride when families must be fed, and so the gong farmer endured night after night in silence, in filth, in mortal risk. And yet, in their own strange way, they were part of a greater rhythm for the waste. They carried was sometimes sold to farmers as fertilizer, turned into nourishment for the fields, and thus the cycle of decay became a cycle of life, their dangerous and despised labor feeding harvests that sustained entire communities. So, as you imagine the echo of boots against whetstone, the breath caught in acrid fumes, the weary figure emerging from darkness at dawn, carrying both wages and scars, know that these men remind us of an unspoken truth, that even the most unpleasant and dangerous labors are threads in the fabric of civilization, threads without which the grander patterns could never hold. And with that, as dawn breaks across the medieval town and the gong farmers slip away to their hidden lodgings, we turn to another chapter of history, where danger came not from waste and shadow, but from sickness itself, and where men walked willingly into plague-stricken streets with beaked masks and trembling hearts. When the Middle Ages reached their darkest hours, and the Black Death swept like a shadow across Europe, claiming millions of lives and leaving entire villages silent in its wake, another profession emerged that was as dangerous as any in history, for these were the plague doctors, men who walked into the very heart of disease when others fled, their long dark cloaks brushing the cobblestones, their wide-brimmed hats tilted low, and their faces hidden behind masks shaped like the beaks of birds, masks stuffed with herbs and spices thought to purify the poisoned air. And though today that image seems strange and almost theatrical, in their own time it was a symbol of both fear and hope. For when the plague doctor appeared in the streets, it meant that death was near, but also that someone had chosen to remain behind, to tend to the dying when families could not. Imagine the narrow alleys of a plague-stricken city, shutters closed, tight silence, broken only by the rattle of carts carrying bodies to mass graves. And in this heavy air walked the plague doctor, carrying a cane to keep distance, a ledger to record the fallen, and a heart weighed down by the knowledge that each house entered was another step into danger. Their work was not glamorous, for they were often hired by towns rather than by patients. Their wages high, but their status low, and they faced suspicion, mistrust, and sometimes even violence. For those desperate and afraid blamed them for bringing death as often as they thanked them for care. The danger they faced was immense, for though their robes were coated with wax and their masks filled with herbs, like lavender and rosemary. The truth was that they had no true protection, and the disease passed through the air, through fleas, through touch, and many plague doctors fell ill themselves, their names lost to the same records they had written for others. Yet, despite the risk, they continued because someone had to. Because human societies cannot abandon themselves entirely to chaos, and so men, often young physicians seeking to learn, or sometimes simple individuals lured by high pay, stepped forward to face a job that meant walking alongside death every hour of the day. Consider the psychological burden of this work, of opening door after door to find families collapsed together, of hearing the cough of infection echoing in streets that once rang with laughter, of carrying the smell of sickness in one's very clothes, and yet continuing writing down names, offering what little medicine they knew, sometimes lancing buboes, sometimes prescribing bloodletting, always grasping for cures that would not come. Yet they were not entirely powerless, for their records, meticulous though grim, later provided historians and scientists with some of the earliest data about epidemics, about the spread of disease. And in this way, their dangerous job carried a legacy beyond their own lives, a legacy that whispers even now in our understanding of medicine. Still, in their own time, they were shadows, walking reminders of mortality and children feared. Their bird-like masks as harbingers of doom, yet behind those beaks were human eyes, human hands, men who felt fear, who longed for safety, but who continued because the world needed them. As night fell upon plague cities and fires burned in attempts to cleanse the air, plague doctors walked quietly, their canes tapping softly upon the stone. And though death was their constant companion, they were also companions to the dying, and in that silent service, they offered a small measure of dignity to lives slipping away. So when we remember them now, not as grotesque figures in costume, but as workers in one of the most dangerous roles ever known, we see, again, the theme that has guided us since the gladiators of Rome, that men and women throughout time have accepted danger, endured peril, and walked into fear, not always for glory, not always for riches, but because survival, duty, and the human need to care for one another have demanded it. And as we close the shutters of the plague-stricken city and turn to the east, another dangerous job awaits us, one that exchanged the fear of invisible sickness for the sharp edge of steel, and where men in faraway Japan risked their very bodies to prove the strength of a sword. Across the seas, in the land of Japan, during an age when samurai ruled not only with loyalty and discipline, but also with the sharp gleam of steel, there was a profession so unusual and so perilous that it stands out among the most dangerous jobs in history. And this was the work of the sword tester, a man tasked with proving the quality of newly forged blades by cutting not straw, not wood, not lifeless dummies, but the bodies of condemned criminals. And sometimes, in whispered accounts, even the bodies of the dead freshly laid to rest. For in a society where honor, precision, and the reputation of a swordsmith mattered deeply, nothing less than human flesh and bone could serve as the true test of steel. Imagine the stillness of a courtyard where such a grim task unfolded, the silence broken only by the rustle of silk garments and the faint chirp of cicadas as a condemned man was brought forth, kneeling with resignation or trembling with fear. And into this scene stepped the tester, often a skilled swordsman himself, trained not only to wield the blade, but to strike with controlled precision. For the purpose was not cruelty, but proof that the edge was flawless, that the cut could pass cleanly through bone and sinew, and that the weapon bore the craftsmanship worthy of a samurai's hand. The danger of this profession lay not only in the violent act itself, but in the profound weight of responsibility for a poorly executed cut reflected shame upon the tester. Even if the blade itself was at fault, and the consequences of dishonor in such a culture were grave. Moreover, there was physical risk, for in the act of testing upon live bodies, sudden movements could lead to counterattack, and accidents were not unknown. And even when the subject was lifeless, the act of striking with such force carried strain upon muscles, joints, and bones, leaving the tester scarred not just in body, but in spirit. Yet these men continued because the demand was great, and swordsmiths desired reputations that would travel across provinces, and in this intricate web of expectation, the tester became a necessary link, balancing upon the edge of danger each time he raised the weapon. Consider the psychological toll of this work, of living each day with the memory of faces, of feeling the shiver of resistance as blade met body, of carrying not only the admiration of clients, but the silent judgment of society that both feared and needed such men. And yet in this strangeness lies the truth of dangerous labor, that men have always stepped into roles that others would not, because honor, survival, or simple necessity demanded it. The sword testers, though few in number and rarely remembered by name, shaped the history of Japanese blades for their markings. Sometimes engraved upon the tang of swords, bore witness to tests that confirmed the blade's strength marks that collectors still whisper about today as proof of authenticity. And though their profession ended with the passing of centuries, with the decline of samurai rule and the rise of modern law, the image of the tester remains as haunting as it is fascinating. A reminder of a time when danger was tied not only to survival, but to artistry, to the union of craft and death, and to the fragile balance between honor and mortality. As twilight falls upon the quiet temples and the distant mountains of Japan, glow in the fading sun, we leave behind the world of sword testers, carrying with us the echo of steel and the weight of lives measured by a single stroke. And we step now into another darkness, not the refined silence of samurai courts, but the choking, suffocating depths of mines, where men risked everything beneath the surface of the earth in search of coal. With the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, when machines began to hum and factories filled the air with smoke, another profession took root as one of the most dangerous in all of history. For beneath the ground, hidden from the sun and swallowed by darkness, men and even children labored as coal miners, their bodies bent low in narrow tunnels, their lungs filled with dust, their hands blistered from endless hours of work. And though their efforts powered engines, lit cities, and transformed societies, the price they paid was often their very lives. Imagine the entrance to a mine at dawn, a line of weary figures, carrying lamps, their clothes already marked with soot, their eyes dull with exhaustion, yet determined by necessity, and as they descended into the earth, the air grew thick, damp, and close, the light of day replaced by flickering lanterns that barely pushed back the blackness. The work itself was relentless, swinging pickaxes into stubborn stone, loosening chunks of coal, loading carts, and pushing them along uneven rails, all while the constant threat of collapse pressed down from above, the earth groaning under its own weight, a reminder that at any moment beams might snap, walls might cave, and lives might be buried in silence. Beyond collapse lay another enemy, the invisible presence of gas, fire damp that could ignite with a single spark, sending fire racing through tunnels, or black damp that crept into lungs, suffocating men before they could reach the surface. And though canaries and lamps offered warnings, they were fragile defenses against forces that struck without mercy. The miners also carried with them the slow enemy of dust particles that settled deep into their lungs, leading to black lung disease, a condition that brought coughing, weakness, and an early death. And so even those who avoided sudden catastrophe were seldom spared from the long shadows of their work. And yet, despite the dangers, men entered the mines, day after day, driven by hunger, by the need to provide for families, by the absence of other work in towns built around coal, and even children were sent down, small bodies able to crawl through narrow seams, their youth sacrificed to the demand for fuel. Consider the soundscape of the mine, the steady rhythm of picks striking rock, the scrape of carts on tracks, the murmur of voices in the dark, and occasionally the sudden silence when a tremor shook the earth, followed by frantic cries as men struggled to escape collapse. And though fear was constant, it became as familiar as breath, woven into daily routine until danger felt almost ordinary. But what made this job endure was not simply desperation, for there was also a kind of pride among miners, a sense of brotherhood forged in shared risk, in the knowledge that each man's life depended upon the vigilance of the others. And in this solidarity, they found strength to continue. Above ground, families waited, anxiously wives scanning the horizon for smoke or for the dreaded messengers who arrived with news of disaster. And yet meals were cooked, children were raised, and life moved forward, sustained by the wages drawn from the darkness below. Coal mining was not only dangerous, but also essential, for it powered the engines that drove the revolution, fueled ships that crossed oceans, and brought light to homes that had known only candles. And in this way, miners bore the paradox of dangerous work, that their peril gave life and progress to countless others. Picture them emerging at day's end, faces blackened, eyes red, bodies weary, yet still climbing back into daylight. And know that for many, this cycle lasted a lifetime, until disease or accident finally claimed them. Their legacy is carved into history, not in monuments of stone, but in the soot-stained walls of old towns, in the rusting rails of abandoned mines, and in the very shape of modern industry, which rose upon their sacrifice. And so as we leave the dark tunnels behind and breathe once more the open air, we carry with us the echo of picks striking stone, and the coughs of men bent low in the dust, and we turn our gaze outward to the sea, where danger took on another form, not beneath the ground, but upon the restless waves in the lives of those who pursued the greatest creatures of the ocean, the whalers, upon the vast open seas of the 18th century, when ships carved slow and uncertain paths across waters that seemed endless in the horizon. Stretched like a promise, both alluring and dangerous, there existed a profession that brought men face to face with some of the largest and most powerful creatures on earth, a profession filled with risk, endurance, and the scent of salt and blood. And this was the life of the whaler. To step aboard a whaling ship in that era was to accept not only months or even years away from the comforts of home, but also the constant peril of storms, hunger, isolation, and the violent struggle between fragile wooden boats and whales that weighed more than entire villages, creatures whose strength could shatter a vessel with a single strike of tail or jaw. Imagine the deck of a whaling ship at dawn, the timbers creaking as waves lapped against its hull. The men stirring from hammocks, faces weathered, hands blistered from rope and oar, and above them, the sails straining against the wind, carrying them ever further into waters rich with promise and peril alike. Their quarry was the whale sought for its oil, which burned bright in lamps across Europe and America, for its baleen used in corsets and household goods, and for its ambergris, a substance prized by perfumers. And so these creatures of the deep were hunted with a determination that was both relentless and dangerous. When a lookout cried, "There she blows," from the mast, a cry that rang like a spark through weary hearts, the crew scrambled into small open boats, lowered into the waves, each man clutching an oar, each breath tight with expectation. For now they faced the Leviathan directly. Surface, and as the boat drew closer, the sea grew tense, the whale's massive body cutting through the water with ease, dwarfing the fragile craft that dared to chase it. With a sudden thrust, the harpoon flew sinking into living flesh, and in that instant, the calm sea erupted into chaos, for the whale did not submit, but fought, thrashing with immense power, diving deep and pulling the boat in what sailors called the Nantucket sleigh ride, a desperate, breathless chase as the line whizzed through calloused hands, burning skin and snapping bones if gripped too tightly. Many men died in these moments, dragged overboard, crushed beneath a whale's flukes, or lost forever to the deep when boats capsized. And yet they continued because the rewards were so great and the world demanded the oil that only whales could provide. Life aboard the ship was no less dangerous. 4 months stretched into years. Food, spoiled water, turned foul, tempers frayed, and illness spread easily in the cramped quarters where men lived shoulder to shoulder. And even when no whale threatened them, storms rose with little warning, tossing ships like toys, tearing masts, and dashing men overboard into seas that swallowed them without mercy. Still, amid this danger, bonds formed a brotherhood of sailors, united by hardship songs sung beneath the stars, and a shared endurance that became its own kind of pride. For to be a whaler was to endure what others would not, to stand at the edge of the world and bring back treasure wrested from its depths. Yet the cost was immense, not only in human lives, but in the dwindling numbers of whales themselves, for, as ships grew faster and weapons more efficient, the hunts grew more frequent, and the great whales that had once moved freely across oceans began to vanish, a silence spreading across waters where once spouts had risen like fountains of breath. The danger for the men never diminished, however, for even as profits grew, the ocean remained indifferent, and each voyage was a gamble between fortune and death. Picture a whaler at night, lying in his hammock as the ship swayed, the smell of salt and oil thick in the air, the cries of gulls fading with the day, and know that within him lingered both fear and determination, for tomorrow might bring calm seas or storms, might bring whales or empty waters, might bring triumph or tragedy. To be a whaler was to live at the mercy of forces larger than oneself, both creature and ocean, and to accept that each day balanced upon a knife's edge. And so when we recall this profession now, we see men who braved the unknown, who risked death upon every hunt, and whose work illuminated cities even as it consumed lives. And as we leave behind the rolling waves and the cries of men chasing giants across the sea, we step forward into another chapter of dangerous labor, not upon the water's surface, but high upon scaffolds and beams, where the builders of skyscrapers faced their own dizzying trials. As the 20th century dawned, and cities like New York and Chicago swelled with ambition, humanity turned its eyes upward, seeking to pierce the sky with towers of steel and glass that would proclaim progress to the world. And in this race to build higher than ever before, imagine the skeleton of a rising skyscraper, beams stacked like the bones of some immense giant, each one gleaming with new steel, and upon them moved tiny figures, men walking casually along narrow girders, as if they were sidewalks, their boots clanging softly with each step, their bodies swaying with the wind, and far beneath them the city pulsed with carts, carriages, and people oblivious to the quiet ballet of danger unfolding above their heads. These men, many of them immigrants, Irish, Italian, and especially Mohawk ironworkers from Canada, carried with them not only the strength of body, but the fearlessness of spirit. For each day demanded that they defy the pull of gravity, hoisting rivets, swinging hammers, guiding beams into place with precision, and trusting one another with their very lives. The danger was constant and merciless, for a single slip meant a fall of hundreds of feet, a fall that no man could survive, and in an age before modern safety harnesses and nets, death was as much a companion as the wind. Yet they continued, because wages were good, because pride was fierce, and because to build the tallest towers in the world was to etch one's labor into the very skyline of history. Red-hot rivet tossed through the air by the heater caught deftly in a pail, then hammered into place with ringing force, sparks flying, hands blistered, sweat pouring, and all the while the city stretched endlessly beneath him, the voices of pedestrians rising faintly like whispers from another world. The men grew used to eating lunches, seated casually on beams, hundreds of feet above the ground, their sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, their coffee in tin flasks, and the famous photographs that show them smiling at impossible heights capture not bravado alone, but the reality of their daily existence, where danger had become routine. Still, routine did not lessen the risk, for wind could whip, suddenly rain could slick, the beams fatigue could blur the senses, and many men slipped and fell, their stories seldom recorded, their names remembered only by families left behind. The psychological toll was heavy too, for each climb demanded not only strength, but calm, a steadiness of mind that could quiet the instinctive fear of falling. And though some men claimed never to look down, the truth was that the height was always there, pressing upon the senses, reminding them with each breath that life balanced upon inches of steel. Yet there was pride in this work, a fierce pride that came from knowing that cities grew because of their hands, that monuments of commerce and culture rose not from architects' drawings alone, but from the sweat and courage of those who climbed, hammered, and built at perilous heights. As towers rose higher, skylines transformed, and the world looked in awe at buildings like the Empire State Building, men continued to risk their lives with each new floor, their figures silhouetted against the sky, part of the landscape of progress. And though many were lost, more continued to climb, driven by the same mixture of necessity, community, and daring that had driven dangerous professions for centuries. Consider the view they held, the city stretching like a tapestry of smoke, brick, and river, the sun casting golden light upon rooftops, the breeze sharp and cold. And know that in those moments, standing upon a narrow girder, the worker carried not only fear, but also wonder, a perspective few would ever share. Their legacy is not only in the buildings that remain, but in the photographs, the oral histories, the whispered tales of men who laughed and worked where others dared not tread. And in remembering them, we see again the enduring truth of dangerous jobs, that progress has always been built upon risk, upon lives willing to balance, upon uncertainty. And as we step down now from the dizzying heights of steel, leaving behind the clang of rivets and the whistle of wind at impossible altitudes, we turn once more to another realm of danger, one not in the air above, but in the shadow of battlefields, where men faced perils not from gravity or machines, but from fire itself for the job of the wartime. Firefighter awaited a calling as treacherous as it was vital. When the world was plunged into the darkness of the Second World War, danger no longer waited only in battlefields or distant seas, for it came instead to the very heart of cities, falling from the night sky in the form of bombs that tore through homes, factories, and churches. And in those moments, when fire burst forth from rubble and smoke choked the air, there were men and women who stepped forward into one of the most perilous roles of the era, for these were the wartime firefighters, guardians of flame and shadow, whose duty was to rush toward destruction when all others fled. Imagine the streets of London during the Blitz, the air raid sirens wailing their mournful cry, families scrambling into shelters, the rumble of bombers overhead, and then the sudden roar as high explosive devices struck, buildings collapsing in showers of brick and glass, followed by the sinister whoosh of incendiary bombs, small canisters that ignited upon impact, scattering magnesium flames so fierce they could melt through metal and spread fire from rooftop to rooftop. Into this inferno came the firefighters clad not in the advanced protective gear of modern times, but in heavy coats and simple helmets, carrying hoses, ladders, and axes, their bodies and lungs exposed to smoke, debris, and the constant threat of collapse. The danger was immense, for the city was not only burning, but still under attack. And as these men and women climbed ladders to battle flames, licking the night sky, bombs continued to fall around them, shrapnel tearing through the air, explosions shaking the very ground upon which they stood. Many were volunteers, ordinary citizens, who by day worked in offices, shops, or schools, and by night faced down firestorms driven not by pay or glory, but by the simple necessity of protecting their neighborhoods, their families, and the very survival of their cities. The work was relentless, for once a raid ended, smoldering embers remained, threatening to reignite. And so firefighters worked long into dawn, their bodies coated in ash, their eyes red with exhaustion, knowing that before night fell again, the bombers might return and the cycle would begin anew. Consider the psychological weight of their role, of standing on a rooftop with flames beneath and bombers above, of hearing the shriek of falling ordnance while gripping a hose and refusing to run, of carrying the memory of cries from those trapped in burning buildings, voices that sometimes faded before they could be reached, and yet returning night after night to face the same terror again. The danger extended beyond the immediate flames, for smoke, inhalation, weakened lungs, burns, scarred skin, collapsing walls, crushed bodies. An entire crews could be lost when a single strike brought down the structure they fought to save. And yet these risks became part of their reality, endured with quiet resilience that has earned them remembrance in history. The bravery of wartime firefighters was not confined to London alone, for across Europe and beyond, in cities like Hamburg, Coventry, Tokyo, and countless others, men and women took up the same perilous role, battling fires ignited by bombs, often with limited water supplies, broken equipment, and the knowledge that their efforts, however valiant, could not always save what was lost. In Hamburg and Dresden, firestorms consumed entire districts, flames so intense that the air itself became a furnace, drawing in oxygen and creating winds that toppled buildings. And still, firefighters entered, attempting to carve small victories from overwhelming destruction, rescuing survivors where they could, containing blazes even as the city seemed to melt around them. In Tokyo, when incendiary raids unleashed walls of fire upon wooden neighborhoods, firefighters faced heat that could strip skin and smoke, so dense that day became night. And still, they worked, moving water by bucket-pulling bodies from ruins, enduring losses so immense that even memory could scarcely contain them. Yet, despite such overwhelming odds, their presence mattered deeply, for even when flames could not be extinguished, their efforts saved countless lives, bought precious time for evacuations, and offered to shattered communities the reassurance that someone still stood between them and the abyss. Their courage carried not the loud triumphs of battlefield victories, but the quiet, steady persistence of men and women who accepted daily risk without question, who endured exhaustion, fear, and grief, and who knew that their role was both essential and thankless. Picture a firefighter in the early hours after a raid, standing amid rubble still warm with flame helmet, dented face, streaked with soot eyes, hollow with fatigue, and yet hands steady as he coils a hose or helps lift a survivor from debris. And imagine the silence that follows, broken only by crackling embers and distant sirens, the knowledge heavy in his heart that before nightfall the skies would roar again. The legacy of wartime firefighters is one of endurance, of ordinary people transformed into extraordinary guardians by the circumstances of war. And though many perished, their courage left behind not monuments of stone, but living cities, communities, preserved because someone chose to face fire instead of flee from it. And as we remember them now, their silhouettes against burning rooftops, their voices calling through smoke, their determination, holding steady against chaos, we see once more the truth that has carried us through each chapter, that dangerous jobs, though harsh and often fatal, have always drawn forth resilience, sacrifice, and an unyielding belief in the value of human life. And so, as we leave behind the smoke-filled nights of wartime cities and the glow of fire against black skies, we turn to our final chapter, where danger takes on its most modern form in the skies themselves, where test pilots risked everything to push machines faster, higher, and further than any human had dared before. As the 20th century unfolded into an age of speed, innovation, and the ceaseless pursuit of the skies, there emerged a profession that seemed to balance at the very boundary of human possibility, a calling that placed men into machines not yet proven safe, into cockpits where controls trembled with uncertainty. Engines roared with untested power, and each flight carried the question of whether it would be a triumph or a tragedy. And this was the life of the test pilot. To become such a pilot was to accept a contract not merely with danger, but with destiny. For these were the individuals who would push the limits of aviation, who would carry aircraft higher, faster, and further than anyone before them, and in so doing would expose themselves to risks greater than those faced by almost any other profession of their time. Imagine the dawn at a remote airfield, the air crisp, the hangars silent, and at the center of the runway, a prototype aircraft waiting like a restless beast, its fuselage gleaming in the first light of morning, its wings unfamiliar in shape, its engine an experiment of fuel and fire. And into this uncertain machine climbs the test pilot, strapping in with steady hands, though he knows that today's flight may end not with a landing, but with smoke upon the horizon. The danger was omnipresent, for early aircraft designs were often unproven, their weaknesses unknown, and the job of the pilot was precisely to reveal those weaknesses, to take the machine to its limits, to push beyond safe boundaries until flaws emerged. And this meant flying through stalls, spins, and vibrations that could tear wings from the frame, enduring the crushing force of acceleration, the blinding rush of speed, and the bone-rattling shudder of untested engines. Many test pilots never returned from their mission, their planes breaking apart in mid-air, their parachutes failing, or their bodies unable to withstand the punishing forces of flight. And yet others continued, driven by a strange mixture of duty, adventure, and the desire to advance human knowledge of the skies. The Second World War had already shown the importance of aviation, and in its aftermath, nations invested heavily in new designs: jet engines, supersonic aircraft, experimental wings, all of which required brave souls willing to sit in the cockpit and trust their lives to machines that might betray them at any second. Among these men were legends, names like Chuck Yeager, who in 1947 broke the sound barrier in the Bell X-1, enduring a moment when his plane shook so violently that many believed it would disintegrate. And yet, in passing through that invisible wall of speed, he opened the way to supersonic flight. But for every celebrated success, there were countless unknowns, men who flew prototypes that failed, who perished in test field or vanished into clouds, never to return, and their stories were often recorded only in reports, their courage buried beneath technical language of failure analysis. Consider the psychological toll of stepping into such a cockpit, of knowing that the engineers themselves were uncertain whether the machine would hold together, of carrying in one's mind the knowledge that each flight could be final, and yet choosing to ignite the engines, to accelerate down the runway, to lift into the sky, and trust skill and instinct against forces no man had ever endured before. Beyond the dangers of flight itself lay the strain upon the body, for as speeds climbed and altitudes rose, test pilots endured G-forces that blurred vision, that pressed blood from their brains until consciousness wavered. And though pressure suits and oxygen systems were developed, these too were often experimental, their failures adding yet another layer of risk. And yet, despite all this, test pilots pressed forward, because their work was essential to progress, because without them, the dreams of supersonic travel, of jetliners crossing oceans, of rockets piercing the stratosphere, could never have been realized. Their danger carried with it the pride of being at the edge of discovery, of seeing the world from altitudes no one else had reached, of hearing the first whispers of sound barriers breaking, of feeling the moment when humankind stepped closer to the stars. Still, there was loneliness in their role, for many test pilots could not speak openly of their missions, bound by secrecy, and their families lived in constant fear that each flight might be the last, that a knock at the door would bring news of tragedy. Yet history remembers them, not only for the risks they took, but for the paths they opened, for the way they carried humanity forward on wings that might otherwise never have flown. Picture a test pilot at dusk, climbing from the cockpit after a successful flight, his body weary, his face lined with strain, but his eyes alive with the knowledge that he has touched a boundary of the possible, that he has flown where no one else has flown. And though tomorrow may demand another risk, tonight he walks across the runway with quiet pride. Their legacy lives not only in military aircraft and commercial planes, but in the very spirit of exploration. For their courage set the stage for astronauts who would ride rockets into space, for engineers who would design crafts to circle the globe, and for a world that takes for granted the safety and speed of flight. To remember them is to remember the final thread in this tapestry of dangerous jobs, a profession where the stakes were not only life and death, but also the very pace of progress itself, where each flight carried the chance of failure, but also the promise of tomorrow. And as we gently bring this journey to its close, leaving behind the roar of engines and the shimmer of contrails in the sky, we pause to reflect on the long line of workers whose peril has shaped our world, from the gladiators of Rome to the miners beneath the earth from the plague, doctors who walked among sickness to the firefighters who stood against flame, each one a reminder that the story of humanity has always been bound to those who dared to risk their lives so that others might live, prosper, or dream higher.